Well, President Joe Biden is in a tough spot. You see, last week, Donald Trump, his chief political opponent, was convicted on 34 felony counts of meh. And Joe Biden said that the justice system had worked. In fact, any talk about the justice system not working was undermining our democracy, was undermining our institutions. Well, now, Joe Biden's son, Hunter, is in the dock in Wilmington, Delaware, on federal gun charges because it turns out that he pretty clearly lied on his gun registration form, that when he went to buy a gun, he clearly was a drug addict. He lied on his forms about being a drug addict, and all of that culminated in a situation in which his girlfriend, who at the time was his brother's widow, which again, she apparently was so afraid of Hunter having a gun that she took it, she drove it over to a local store, tossed it in a trash can, which happened to be near a school. Secret Service then tried to cover it up. Then, as you'll recall, this was looked into by Joe Biden's DOJ, and there were whistleblowers who came forward alleging that the Biden DOJ had essentially hamstrung prosecutors from investigating Hunter Biden's involvement with his father, Joe, and went out of their way to cut some sort of deal to close the tax case that was also being investigated against Hunter Biden. There were two simultaneous cases being investigated against Hunter Biden. One was the gun charge. The other was the fact that Hunter Biden has spent his entire adult life traveling around the globe, picking up sacks of cash on behalf of the Biden family, because Joe Biden is an extraordinarily corrupt politician on behalf of his own family. Literally every adult member of his family has trafficked in Joe Biden's name in order to make money with Joe Biden's permission and or involvement. So there was a full-scale tax investigation going on. Whistleblowers came forward and they said that Joe Biden's DOJ had been told to basically look the other way on the tax investigation. This all came to a head, too, when it turned out that the DOJ tried to cut a sweetheart deal with Hunter Biden, wherein he would be essentially directed to rehab for his drug problem. And as part of the plea agreement, all the tax charges would simply go away. They would randomly be dismissed. And the judge in that particular case looked at this plea agreement and said, this makes no sense. How is this okay? Why is it my job to excuse him on the tax charges because you are trying to sign some sort of agreement with him on the drug charges? And she asked the prosecution, are you actually freeing him up on the tax charges? They said no. And the defense said, well, if you're not freeing him up on the tax charges, then we're not taking the deal. We're not going to plead guilty in any way if you're not going to free him up on the tax charges. So basically, the prosecution and the defense had gotten together and they decided to try to sneak one past the judge. The judge said no, the whole thing blew up. And this is how you end up with a prosecution in Wilmington, Delaware on these gun charges. Now, this is an open and shut case. It is an open and shut case. It is obvious that Hunter Biden lied on his federal drug forms, on his federal gun forms, rather. According to the Wall Street Journal, on a Friday evening in October 2018, Hunter Biden rolled up in a black Cadillac to StarQuest Shooters and Survival Supply in the Delaware city where he'd been born and raised. A salesman standing in the window didn't initially recognize him as the son of the state's longtime Democratic senator, now President Biden, and would later recall declining a tip from the younger Biden as he purchased a .38 caliber Colt Cobra revolver. However, it turns out that Hunter, in fact, was a drug addict at the time. Many of the jurors know the Biden family, of course. A jury of 6 men and 6 women, along with 4 alternates, was ultimately impaneled late on Monday afternoon. Today, federal prosecutors and Biden's lawyers are slated to deliver their opening statements to the jury. President Biden did put out a statement on all of this. His statement said, quote, I am the president, but I am also a dad. Jill and I love our son, and we are so proud of the man he is today. Hunter's resilience in the face of adversity and the strength he has brought to his recovery are inspiring to us. Are they, though? He's currently ignoring a daughter he has. He's currently not paying the bills he owes apparently to his ex-wife. He has his father's rich friends paying his legal bills, at least until very recently. And he is clearly money laundering with paintings, with finger paintings that people are buying for extraordinary sums of money to put money into Hunter Biden's pocket. Why? Well, not because Hunter Biden is an amazing painter, but because his father is president of the United States. The president continued, a lot of families have loved ones who have overcome addiction and know what we mean. As the president, I don't and won't comment on pending federal cases. But as a dad, I have boundless love for my son, confidence in him, and respect for his strength. Our family has been through a lot together, and Jill and I are going to continue to be there for Hunter and our family with our love and support. Now, the reality is that Joe Biden has already spoken out about this case. Joe Biden has spent years saying that Hunter literally did nothing wrong. So what exactly is he talking about that he's not speaking out about this case? Now, again, he's clearly guilty. As Andrew Kerr, investigative reporter for the Free Beacon, writes, literally one day after purchasing his gun on October 12, 2018, Hunter Biden set up a drug deal with somebody named Mookie at the 7-Eleven on Green Hill and Lancaster. And apparently he texted his, again, then girlfriend, his brother's widow, and weird family, said, he has my money, Mad. I'm getting pissed. So everybody in the family knew that he was, in fact, a drug addict. And as the Wall Street Journal points out, there's no question about any of this. He wrote about it in his memoirs. In the gun case, federal prosecutors are planning to use the younger Biden's own words against him. They're expected to draw from excerpts of Biden's memoir published in 2021, Beautiful Things. Among the excerpts is a section of the book about returning to Delaware in October 2018. Quote, all my energy revolves around smoking drugs and making arrangements to buy drugs, feeding the beast. So he literally wrote in his memoir about being a drug addict at a time he was lying on his federal gun forms. In court papers ahead of the trial, federal prosecutors have previewed a witness list that includes Hunter Biden's ex-wife, Kathleen Buell, and Hallie Biden. Prosecutors did not reference either woman by name. Both are identifiable by their descriptions. Prosecutors say that Buell checked Hunter Biden's car periodically because she didn't want their kids in a vehicle with drugs. By the way, he is an admirable figure. This is 6 years ago, guys. Hunter Biden is in his mid-50s. This is not a wayward child. This dude is a middle-aged, drug-addicted piece of crap. On about a dozen occasions, prosecutors said, she found drugs or paraphernalia, which she discarded in a trash can. In a March 2018 text message, she wrote, I also found a few crack pipes. I took them out because our daughter was driving the car. What a delight he is. And of course, there are all sorts of pictures of him doing crack on that computer that he left behind at a repair shop because he was high as a kite. So Hunter Biden's defense, supposedly, is the legality of the gun sale. They're going to try and blame it on the gun shop. They're going to say they should have known that he was lying and that he was clearly high, so they shouldn't have sold him the gun in the first place, because also they accepted Biden's passport as identification. We'll get to more on this in just one moment. First, when did we decide to stop upholding free speech as a basic right? What's playing out right now at big tech companies is pretty dangerous stuff. It doesn't matter what your politics are or who you voted for. Everyone should have the right to express themselves freely. To fight back against big tech's control of the internet, I use ExpressVPN. Have you ever considered the extent to which free-to-access tech giants invade your privacy for profit? They meticulously track your searches, video history, and every click you make. They construct a detailed profile of you, and then they sell your sensitive data. This is your privacy they're exploiting. Using the ExpressVPN app on your phone or computer is a simple and effective way to protect your online privacy. The software conceals your IP address from third parties, making it harder for companies to track and sell your data to advertisers. It's your shield against online surveillance. ExpressVPN encrypts 100% of your network data to protect you from eavesdroppers and cybercriminals. Stop allowing big tech to revoke our rights to free speech. Instead, revoke their right to your data. Secure your internet with the VPN I trust for online protection. Visit expressvpn.com/Ben. That's expressvpn.com/Ben to get 3 extra months for free. expressvpn.com/Ben. So, what is really going on here? I'll tell you what's really going on here. Joe Biden won Wilmington, Delaware, which is the jurisdiction for this trial. He won that city, which is, again, his hometown, 26,698 votes to 3,580 votes. In other words, Donald Trump won about 11.8% of the vote in the jurisdiction where Hunter Biden is currently being tried. And in fact, Delaware is a very small state. Joe Biden has long been the favored son of Delaware because he's brought home the bacon. Joe Biden was largely involved in the transformation of Delaware from sleepy backwater to a place where pretty much all businesses are organized, particularly credit card businesses, which have made an absolute bundle off their association with Joe Biden over the years. So in other words, this is Joe Biden's town. This is so much Joe Biden's town that there are buildings named for him at the University of Delaware, where his wife got her ed degree, her PhD. By the way, some of the more uncomfortable texts in the Hunter Biden trial refer to his stepmother, Jill. The texts are pretty ugly. Apparently, during this period, he texted his then girlfriend, again, his brother's widow. I can't emphasize enough how weird this family is. Quote, F my stepmother for always being as much of a selfishly silly, entitled bleep, C-word, as you. He was dating Hallie at the time. That relationship oddly did not work out. He apparently also said that his stepmother was, quote, a vindictive moron. I supported my GM family, including some of the costs you should have used your salary to pay for the last 24 years. And you do know the drunkest I've ever been is still smarter than you could ever comprehend. And you're a bleep grammar teacher that wouldn't survive one class in an Ivy graduate program. So go F yourself, Jill. Let's all agree I don't like you any more than you like me. So, things are great in the Biden family. But the point here is this. The Biden family owns Wilmington. They own Wilmington. Wilmington is their hometown. In fact, Joe Biden won more of a percentage in Wilmington than he won in Manhattan, which is where Donald Trump was recently convicted. Donald Trump lost Manhattan by winning about 14.5% of the vote in Manhattan. And again, he only won 12% of the vote in Wilmington. So you have almost a reverse situation with regard to Hunter Biden that you had with Donald Trump. You have very strong charges against Hunter Biden, but you have a jury pool, undoubtedly the vast majority of whom voted for Hunter's dad. As opposed to Manhattan, where you had a very weak case against Donald Trump, in fact, a case that doesn't even specify one specific crime. But you had a jury pool that hates Donald Trump. So what we very easily could watch here, remember, you have to have a unanimous jury to convict. What we very easily could watch here is jury nullification on behalf of Joe Biden in order to let his son off the hook. And here's where things start to get very uncomfortable for Joe Biden. Is it better for Joe Biden's campaign if Hunter Biden is convicted or if he is acquitted? If Hunter Biden is acquitted, everyone is going to see this for what it is, which is the DOJ tried to cut a sweetheart deal with Joe Biden's son. They failed when a judge called them on it. Then they brought the prosecution in a jurisdiction that is the most favorable jurisdiction in human history for a defendant. And then he gets acquitted or there's a hung jury. Does that look like a justice system that is working on behalf of the people? Does that really sound like what Joe Biden said about Donald Trump, that no one is above the law? If he gets convicted, on the other hand, then Joe Biden's son, it turns out, is a lifelong derelict who's going to jail. So presumably, Joe goes out there and he says, the system worked, even though I don't agree with the verdict, and he gets to claim all of that. So he's in this weird, unpalatable situation where probably the best thing politically for Joe Biden is for Hunter to actually be convicted in Wilmington so that he can go out and continue to claim the justice system is working perfectly, which is why Donald Trump might go to jail. As a father, and presumably as a corrupt politician, Joe Biden would very much like to see Hunter acquitted or a hung jury. It is for that reason, I suppose, that the entire Biden family has been sitting in the crowd during the trial. So apparently, on day one, Jill Biden showed up and she sat directly behind Hunter Biden all day. According to ABC News, she watched attentively as some jurors told the court they had such a skewed view of her family they could not be impartial. Ashley Biden also showed up to put her hand on the First Lady's back in support. Hunter Biden's family members also appeared to be actively involved with his defense strategy. At one point, they stood up and huddled with Hunter's attorneys. When court was dismissed, Jill Biden gave Hunter a hug and a kiss before he walked out hand in hand with his current wife. So again, if you're talking about jury interference, what juries think, the human dynamic in Wilmington, Delaware, there is something a little weird about the fact that the defendant in this case, who is the son of the President of the United States, was out biking with dad wearing a shirt that said 46, literally on Sunday. And then he's in court with most of his family, except for, of course, the President of the United States, who is wobbling around on a bike somewhere. Little bit weird. So, will Hunter be acquitted? Doubtful he'll be acquitted. The charges are too strong. But could there be a hung jury? I'll bet on a hung jury. I'll bet on a hung jury right now. I bet you there's at least one or two holdouts inside that jury who believe that the only reason that Hunter is being brought up on charges at all is because of an attempt by the DOJ to look even-handed. All you need to do is buy one juror in a district that Joe Biden won by approximately 70% in order to hold this thing up. And then we'll be lectured by Joe Biden, if there is a hung jury, about how the jury system worked yet again. We'll get to more on this in just a moment. First, there's recently been some monumental news nobody's talking about. For the first time in U.S. history, the interest we pay on our national debt surpassed every individual budget item except for Social Security. This means the United States now spends more on interest than on national defense or even Medicare. It's disgraceful. It's only going to get worse over time, which is why savvy investors, central banks, and concerned savers are turning to gold, because it's not tied to the inflated U.S. dollar. You can do the same with the help of Birch Gold. For over 20 years, Birch Gold Group has helped thousands of Americans protect their savings by converting an IRA or 401k into an IRA in physical gold. To learn more, text BEN to 989898. Claim your free, no-obligation info kit on gold. Birch Gold has earned my trust with their education-first approach, as well as the trust of thousands of other happy customers. Protect your savings today. Text BEN to 989898. Diversification is just a smart business strategy in a time where the economy is really on the rocks, where it looks like inflation is basically baked into the cake. Diversifying by investing in a thing that has not been worth zero ever would be a smart move. Head on over to Birch Gold right now. Text BEN to 989898 to get started. Okay, meanwhile, Anthony Fauci returned to the Hill to be browbeaten by members of Congress. According to the Wall Street Journal, he defended the federal government's leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic and denied influencing research into COVID's origins in a congressional hearing. He also denied he conducted government business on private email, but he acknowledged that a senior advisor named Dr. David Morens had acted inappropriately. Now, we're going to go through this in detail because the truth is that there has been no real reckoning for the government's failures with regard to COVID-19. And when I talk about the government's failures, here I'm talking specifically about the fact that the government, based on crap science, decided to basically shut down the country. As it turns out, in retrospect, the original take that many of us were pushing, and I was pushing this from about April of 2020, was that there should be a tranched out return to work quickly, like young people should go back to work because they weren't particularly vulnerable to COVID. And then presumably there would be community spread and people would get it and they would survive because they are young and healthy. And then you would continue to tranche in members of the population until you got to the elderly. And eventually there would be enough members of the population who already had it that there was nothing else to do, which is exactly, by the way, how Sweden approached this particular problem. And they have less excess mortality than pretty much any country in Europe. That, however, is not the way that these issues were approached by Anthony Fauci. And as it turns out, it wasn't just a mistake. There were also cover-ups associated with the bad public policy that was made by Dr. Fauci. The American people were lied to. They were lied to about 6-foot distancing rules. As it turns out, there was no basis for any of that. We talked about that at the time. We were lied to about the efficacy of masks, particularly for children. We were both ways. First, we were lied to that they were ineffective, which is why only healthcare workers should get them. And then we were told they were so effective, you had to mask toddlers or keep them out of the classroom entirely. Then we were told that the vaccines were not only completely safe, but they were 100% effective. In fact, so effective that they would stop transmission. Dr. Fauci and the entire public health establishment, on the basis of 0 studies, suggested that the mRNA vaccines would stop transmission in its tracks, which of course was a lie and did not happen. And some of us, me included, bought the lie because we were being told that by everyone, up to and including the then president of the United States, Donald Trump. Well, it turns out all of that was false. Dr. Fauci was the head of the medical establishment at the time. Every element of his response was a disaster area. And instead of being treated as the full-scale disaster that he was, the media feted him. They treated him as though he was a great hero in the public mind. His words were used by Joe Biden in order to try to cram down vaccine mandates on 80 million Americans via the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Only our company suing the federal government stopped that from happening, among other plaintiffs in that case. As it turns out, not only that, NIH officials deliberately attempted to hide their emails to avoid FOIA requests on all of this sort of stuff. According to the New York Times from just a couple of days ago, the latest accusations, coming days before a House panel publicly questions Fauci, represent one front of an intensifying push by lawmakers to link American research groups and the country's premier medical research agency with the beginnings of the COVID pandemic. NIH officials whose job it was to produce records under FOIA may have helped their colleagues avoid their obligations under the law, according to several emails. Dr. David Morens, who is the former senior advisor to Dr. Fauci, wrote in February 2021, quote, "I learned from our FOIA lady here how to make emails disappear after I am FOIA'd, but before the search starts, so I think we are all safe." In other words, we're going to hide emails to make sure that the public never see them. That email chain included Dr. Gerald Koich, a scientist and former NIH official, and, of course, Peter Daszak, the president of EcoHealth Alliance. You'll remember EcoHealth Alliance as a group that funneled money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where the virus may well have been developed and then accidentally leaked. Dr. Morens added, quote, "I deleted most of these earlier emails after sending them to Gmail." In another email about an editorial he was helping to prepare in July 2020, Morens reassured his collaborators that sending notes about a sensitive government grant to his official email account was okay because, quote, "I've spoken to our FOIA folks, and I should be safe from future FOIAs." He added, "Don't ask how." And it turns out that this entire network of people working with Fauci knew exactly how to try to avoid FOIA. It turns out they were all discovered anyway, but they were trying to do this, which is the mark of a fully transparent and scientific organization is when they are hiding emails from FOIA requests. In one of these emails from June 2021, Greg Folkers, a former chief of staff to Fauci, was discussing global biosafety practices and referred to a fact sheet from EcoHealth. Folkers rendered the group name as EC-Health. So in other words, there was no O. And they did that specifically to hide it from search. a misspelling that lawmakers said appeared to be a deliberate attempt to keep the email from being caught in keyword searches to fulfill FOIA requests related to EcoHealth. In a separate email the same month, Folkers rendered the last name of Christian Andersen, a prominent virologist who investigated the origins of the pandemic, as, quote, Anderson, but put, instead of an O, a $sign, again, to avoid FOIA requests. So again, these were deliberate attempts to avoid public transparency. Meanwhile, as we are now learning, members of the NIH have earned an absolute bundle from their coordination with Big Pharma. According to the New York Post, new data from the National Institutes of Health revealed the agency and its scientists collected $710 million in royalties during the pandemic from late 2021 through 2023. These are payments made by private companies like pharmaceuticals to license medical innovations from government scientists. Almost all that cash, $690 million, went to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the sub-agency led by Dr. Fauci, and 260 of its scientists. An organization called Open the Books was forced to sue to uncover those royalties. Those are huge numbers, obviously. Payments skyrocketed during the pandemic era. Those years saw more than double the amount of cash flow to the NIH from the private sector compared to the prior 12 combined. All told, it is $1.036 billion. Now, you could, to be fair, see an incentive structure whereby scientists join the NIH because they know that theoretically they can still make money for having patented something unique. However, this does create a massive conflict of interest where the NIH is developing public health policy that allows it to be paid by the private sector. That's about as tightly bundled a corrupt circle as you can find. The NIH makes the public health policy in order to benefit pharmaceuticals who then pay a bunch of money back to the NIH. That is some pretty ugly stuff, for sure. All of that was the backdrop to the hearing surrounding Dr. Fauci yesterday. We'll get to more on this in just one moment. First, you know what's incredibly dumb? Well, obviously, this verdict against Trump in New York City is incredibly dumb, but you know what else is incredibly dumb? Not having life insurance. A lot of life is unpredictable, but a good life insurance plan gives your family a financial safety net to protect against some of those unknowns. Policy Genius is the country's leading online insurance marketplace. It makes choosing the right policy for your family easy and quick. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies starting at just $292 per year for $1 million in coverage. Some options offer same-day approval and avoid those unnecessary medical exams. Policy Genius's technology makes comparing life insurance quotes from America's top insurers really easy. You can do it in just a few clicks. You already have a life insurance policy through work, but that might not offer enough protection for your family needs, and it might not follow you if you leave your job, so you need a backup plan. Policy Genius has licensed agents who can help you find the best fit for your needs. When they make it this easy, there's not an excuse not to do it. Policy Genius works for you, not those insurance companies. They're not incentivized to recommend one insurer over another. You can trust them. Get peace of mind by finding the right life insurance with Policy Genius. Head on over to policygenius.com/Shapiro or click that link in the description. Get your free life insurance quotes. See how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/Shapiro. So there were three major topics that ended up being covered during this particular hearing. One was the lab leak theory. So as you'll recall, Dr. Fauci pretty openly downplayed the lab leak theory. Not only that, Peter Daszak, aforementioned president of EcoHealth Alliance, which, by the way, is a research group that literally was defunded by the federal government recently. In fact, not all that long ago, May 15th, federal health officials suspended funding to a U.S. research organization linked to investigation about the coronavirus's origins, saying the move is, quote, necessary to protect the public interest, given the organization's failure to monitor the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So EcoHealth Alliance was defunded like 2 weeks ago. But if you go all the way back to 2021, you'll recall that Peter Daszak, the president of EcoHealth Alliance, a research group that secured a grant to perform COVID research in Wuhan before the pandemic and involved itself in so-called gain-of-function research, in which viruses were made more virulent, more transmissible from animals to humans, for example, in order to supposedly test how to stop that if it were to happen in the future. Daszak wrote to Fauci in April, saying, quote, to say a personal thank you on behalf of our staff and collaborators, after Fauci dismissed the idea that the pandemic started due to a lab accident in Wuhan. Fauci then replied and thanked Daszak for his kind note. Fauci had been asked directly about the lab leak hypothesis during a briefing, and he said, quote, the evidence was totally consistent with the jump of a species from an animal to a human. Fauci has since publicly shifted his tone. This would be in 2021. So here was Fauci yesterday being asked about this, and he tried to deny a cover-up for the COVID lab leak theory.
And at the time you said to me pretty much what you just said, and I want you to just confirm it for the record, Well, that wasn't us. If that was being done, it wasn't us. Yeah. And you confirmed that for the record, yes?
No,
it wasn't you. It wasn't what you were funding.
What I'm saying is that I cannot account, nor can anyone account, for other things that might be going on in China, which is the reason why I have always said and will say now, I keep an open mind as to what the origin is. But the one thing I know for sure is that the viruses that were funded by the NIH phylogenetically could not be the precursor of SARS-CoV-2.
Okay, so the case that he's been making this case for years, is that first he said there was no gain-of-function research, because gain-of-function research, he says, biologically means the increased virulence of a virus inside the same species, not transferring from one species to another, which is a pretty squirrely way of avoiding responsibility for helping to create viruses that jump from animals to humans. But he has also claimed that the Wuhan Institute of Virology research that was funded via EcoHealth Alliance from the NIH, that research didn't lead to SARS-CoV-2, which would be COVID-19. Okay, that may very well be true. Also, money is fungible. So when you lead to money going to a Wuhan Institute of Virology that engages in precisely the kind of research that you greenlit, and then some of that research may in fact have led to COVID-19, and then that COVID-19 may have escaped the lab and killed millions of people, well, I mean, that's something, is it not? Fauci, for his part, then tried to deny any cover-up with related to the COVID lab leak theory. He says that he was always open-minded about all of this.
Did you cite this article at the White House because the NIH director asked you to suppress the lab leak theory?
I did not do that in response to anybody's suggestion to suppress anything. It was in response to a question that someone asked at the podium. And I did not edit any paper as shown in my official testimony. So you said about 4 or 5 things, Congressman, that were just not true.
Okay, but the big question here is not what the Congresswoman alleged. The big question here is whether he was downplaying the lab leak theory, which he was. And you'll recall that there was coordination between the federal government and social media to shut down people for alleging a lab leak theory. You'll recall that Senator Tom Cotton was raked over the coals by Fauci's allies for suggesting a lab leak theory. So he's gaslighting you here. Then Fauci was asked about the lockdowns. This is issue number 2, or the lockdowns. And he says that the lockdowns were justified and good, which is, again, a strange take, considering that lockdowns very largely coincided with a spike in cases. It turns out that most of the transmission that happened with regard to COVID-19 was done within households. And when you locked people in their households, you ended up spiking many of the cases, which is why, for example, during the summer, the rates of COVID transmission went up in hot areas. And during the winter, when it was very cold, rates of COVID transmission also went up because people with family in close proximity to one another. Now, the reality is that the alternative to the lockdowns and the fake social distancing, which we'll get to in a moment, the alternative to that would have been tranching out the population, shielding and protecting the elderly. This is something they did in Florida. So again, what they did in Sweden, the Great Barrington Declaration pushed by Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. But it was Fauci and his allies who were actively attempting to suppress Bhattacharya and the Great Barrington Declaration and effectively calling them kooks. We'll get to more on this in just one moment. First, June 6th marks the 80th anniversary of the Allied invasion of Normandy, more commonly known as D-Day. Our good friends at Black Rifle Coffee are doing something truly special to commemorate the incredible men who stormed those beaches by land, air, and sea 80 years ago. Evan Hafer and his team will make a series of parachute jumps into Normandy from June 4th to June 6th, fully decked out in World War II-era uniforms. As time marches on, the Black Rifle Coffee crew is making sure they do their part to honor the last of the greatest generation who fought at D-Day while they're still with us. Black Rifle Coffee is a veteran-founded, veteran-run company. It proudly serves coffee and culture to people who love the country. A portion of every single purchase made at blackriflecoffee.com supports veterans and first responder causes. From providing funding and equipment to first responders to helping veterans fight cancer, your money goes a long way toward giving back to those who serve our nation. Visit blackriflecoffee.com to join us and the team of veterans commemorating the hard-fought victory at D-Day. That's blackriflecoffee.com. By the way, their coffee also happens to be excellent. I rely on it every single morning. You can too. Head on over to blackriflecoffee.com to get started. That's blackriflecoffee.com. Here is Fauci, however, claiming the lockdowns were justified. The lockdowns, I know that we've sort of erased this from our memory. The lockdowns broke the country in 2020. The lockdowns combined with the public health establishment's decision that COVID was a woke virus that only affected people protesting the lockdowns, but certainly did not affect people who are out there rioting on behalf of George Floyd. It broke trust in the country. It made everyone insane. But here's Fauci trying to justify himself.
I'm going to go through a list of COVID mitigation measures that you supported over the course of the pandemic and ask you to give me a yes or no as to whether you believe these measures were justified. Business closures?
Early on, when 5,000 people were dying a day, yes.
Church closures?
Same thing.
School closures?
Again,
Stay-at-home orders?
these were important when we were trying to stop the tsunami of deaths that were occurring early on. How long you kept them going is debatable.
How long you kept them going was debatable. You were pushing for them to be kept going for years on end, particularly in schools where there was no actual evidence whatsoever that school transmission was a serious danger to children. One of the things about COVID-19 that was truly amazing is that it really affected disproportionately the elderly and the obese. Those are the people it killed, typically speaking. Fauci then continued along these lines, saying that distancing saved lives, which again is a strange take, considering that distancing between children was unnecessary. Distancing between people who were healthy was unnecessary.
In your view, though, do social distancing recommendations and other public health measures to reduce transmission save lives?
Definitely.
Definitely. Amazing. So he's not backing off one single solitary thing. Now, one of the things he was pushing, the CDC, the NIH, they were all pushing it, was the 6-foot distancing rule. We said this at the time. There was no evidence to back the 6-foot distancing rule. It was complete crap. It was based on supposed droplet studies that were done in the early 20th century with regard to, if you're talking, how far does your spit move? The problem is that COVID, of course, is airborne. So the 6-foot distancing rule makes no sense at all. But it was still being promoted by the federal government for literally years on end. Here's Fauci admitting that the 6-foot rule was very badly predicated, and then he tries to shy that one off on the CDC.
Did you not feel an obligation for something that just sort of appeared, not to go back to the CDC and say, let's base this on what we know?
It was a CDC decision, and it was clear.
Were you dialoguing with the CDC?
Excuse me?
Were you in communication with the CDC?
CDC was part of the coronavirus response team. Yeah.
And you didn't feel an obligation to go to them and say, look, Americans aren't going to trust us.
Yeah.
We're providing them with misinformation.
We have discussions at the White House about that. We did, but the CDC's decision and was their decision to make, and they made it.
Okay, but if you are the science, don't you have to go out there and say that this is not predicated on science? The CDC was still pushing 6-foot distance recommendations until August of 2022. So there are a couple things about Fauci. Yeah, there are people who believe that Dr. Fauci is just a nefarious character who, for his own gain, his own public gain, was attempting to maximize his own power, which would not be a terrible take. Again, when it comes to career bureaucrats who have been very famous, of course, many of them wish to maximize their own role in the public square. This is the problem with bureaucracies. They're constantly attempting to gobble up more power with less accountability. Dr. Fauci is a great example of this. When there are documentaries on Dr. Fauci, one of the things you saw is giant portraits of Dr. Fauci in Dr. Fauci's house. And something I generally don't trust is people who have giant portraits of themselves in their house. That goes for people on all sides of the political aisle. If you have a giant portrait of you above your desk, that's a weird thing. Dr. Fauci is one of those characters. There's also the theory that Dr. Fauci is just a somewhat malicious and somewhat incompetent bureaucrat. In the end, it doesn't really matter, because when political actors delegated all power to the supposed scientific community, the self-interested scientific community, they sold you out. One of the reasons I ended up moving to Florida is because Governor Ron DeSantis did not do this. He recognized that there are trade-offs when it comes to public policy, wrecking the economy, destroying mental health in this country, destroying schooling in this country. None of it was worth the kind of silliness that Dr. Fauci was pushing. Now, whether Dr. Fauci did this out of maliciousness or whether he did it out of negligence, I'm sure that matters when it comes to the possibility of, say, a criminal prosecution for perjury. When it comes to what we do next time this happens, the answer is the political branches of government are elected for a reason. Delegation of their powers to so-called experts in the executive branch, that is a dramatic failure. It's an abdication of duty. It's the biggest mistake that Donald Trump made during his administration. And then, of course, it was tripled and quadrupled down upon well past the time we knew that what Fauci was preaching was not true. Joe Biden was still using Fauci as the voice of science for years afterward. It is hard to think of a thing that Joe Biden has not screwed up. In fact, in Dr. Fauci and his remaining at the NIH to be the scion of science remains one of his worst mistakes. Alrighty, coming up, we'll get into Joe Biden's Pride Month blitz. His campaign is not going well, which means it's time for some more pander-bearing. First, as a dad myself, let me level with you. There's always a lingering question. Are my words sinking in? Yesterday, they were not. Well, this Father's Day, it's time to put those doubts to rest. Show your dad you've been paying attention all along with a gift from Jeremy's Razors, a company that aligns perfectly with dad's values. Right now, Jeremy's Razors is offering 15% off site-wide with code DAD15. That's a deal even dad can't refuse. Now on to the gift suggestions. The Alpha Bundle. That includes Jeremy's radically redesigned second-generation razor. That's one handle, 4 razor cartridges equipped with precision trimmer, shave cream, post-shave balm infused with green tea and menthol, all packaged in a sleek travel case. Here's the clincher. You need to order today to guarantee it lands on Dad's doorstep just in time for Father's Day, because let's face it, tardiness won't cut it. Head on over to jeremy'srazors.com pronto. Don't forget to punch in code DAD15 at checkout for that sweet, sweet 15% off. Meanwhile, Joe Biden, his campaign is flailing. It doesn't matter that his political opponent was just convicted of 34 felonies in New York. It turns out the last few polls have him running even with Joe Biden. In fact, here are the last few polls. Brand new Morning Consult poll, all taken in the aftermath of the conviction. Trump is up 1. In that poll just a few days ago, he was down by 1. That is not because Trump gained support. It's because Biden lost support. Forbes, Harris X, has Trump up 2 on Joe Biden. Reuters Ipsos has Trump down 2 to Biden, but Biden's only at 41%. That's not the way this election is going to end. INI TIPP has them tied. In other words, it turns out that you can convict your political opponents, and that's not going to change a thing if you're a crappy president. Joe Biden is an awful, awful president. And so it's time for more pandering. And apparently, they are going to really stump to get out the vote from gay voters. This is going to be their big thing. According to NBC News, the campaign plans to have a presence this month at more than 200 Pride events in 23 states, including all the battleground states, and to launch a paid media blitz aimed at mobilizing LGBTQ+ divided by sign voters. 2 campaign officials said in details first shared with NBC News. Yes, that's right. They're going to do voter outreach at the parades. Some of Biden's allies worry about waning support among LGBTQ+ divided by sign voters. A poll conducted in January by the LGBTQ+ divided by sign media advocacy group GLAAD found Joe Biden has overwhelming support from LGBTQ+ divided by sign voters overall and in battleground states. But Human Rights Campaign recently committed to spend $15 million in 6 battleground states to help Biden win in November because they are worried that nobody's going to show up for him. It turns out that people are just not all that enthusiastic about Joe Biden, whether they are gay or whether they are straight. So Joe Biden is pulling out all the stops. And that means that he sent out a series of tweets to the trans children. Yes, very important. He sent out a statement to all of the trans, queer, and intersex children out there. He says to the entire LGBTQI+ community, and especially transgender children, please know your president and my entire administration have your back. We see you for who you are, made in the image of God and deserving of dignity, respect, and support. Again, there is nothing more insulting than Joe Biden citing the book of Genesis for the idea that boys are born in girls' bodies. He literally doesn't finish the exact same verse. Made in the image of God comes from the book of Genesis. The ending of that verse is God made man in his image. In man's image, God made him. Male and female, he made them. That's literally the end of the verse. But Joe Biden didn't give a crap about the Bible. In fact, the Bible is only useful when he can pretend to be a Christian while supporting abortion. So he's stumping hard for the gay vote. He's also stumping quite hard for the pro vote. He continues to foist on Israel a deal that Israel certainly did not offer. He continues to pretend that Israel is making this offer that it never made, which is truly an incredible thing. He's playing this game. It's an idiot's game where he suggests that Israel made an offer. Israel never made the offer. Then he suggests that should take the offer that Israel never made. And now he's going to the UN Security Council to supposedly urge to take the offer. First of all, it's a terrorist group. You think they give 2 craps what the UN Security Council has to say? What he's actively attempting to do is have the UN Security Council force a deal Israel did not offer down on Israel while claiming that he is doing it on behalf of Israel, which is the most Orwellian garbage I have seen in quite a while. Meanwhile, he's sending out his State Department to claim that Israel should not, in fact, end. He's doing all this because he wants to win some votes in Dearborn, Michigan. He doesn't want the protesters in Chicago. Now, what he doesn't understand is that by prolonging this war, if the moron had just let Israel finish the job back in February, this war would be over already. Plus, there wouldn't be a war brewing on the northern border for Israel. Over the last 48 hours in Israel, has been firing tons of rockets into northern Israel. They set the entire northern border on fire, literally a giant wildfire in northern Israel. The tape is pretty astonishing. And there's loud clamor from all sides of the political aisle in Israel for Israel to go hard in the north. None of that would be happening if Joe Biden hadn't attempted, in order to placate his radical left fringe base, by pushing Israel into not going into Rafah and finishing the job. Now, the real reason that Egypt, for example, doesn't want Israel in Rafah is because it's been clear that for about a decade, Egypt has been allowing free run of that border in violation of treaty with both Israel and the United States. Egypt doesn't want that uncovered, so they want Israel to stop short. The Biden administration, again, in a bizarre attempt to pay off, is now putting pressure on Israel while claiming that it's putting pressure on. It's absolutely insane. Israel, by the way, has pushed back, saying, we didn't make that offer. What are you talking about? Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke to the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz on Sunday to discuss that latest hostage deal. Notice he's calling everybody who's sort of opposed to Netanyahu in Israel, because all the Biden administration really wants is to get rid of Netanyahu, believing that somehow if they do that, they're going to earn back the love of the pro-Hamas voters. Spoiler alert, ain't going to happen. In his call with Gallant, Blinken, quote, commended Israel's readiness to conclude a deal and affirmed the onus is on to accept. Gallant confirmed he had emphasized Israel's commitment to dismantling as a governing and military authority. And he said that he discussed the issue of identifying and enabling the emergence of a local governing alternative. Now, here's the part that gets a little sticky. It turns out he's been murdering all of the local alternatives. In fact, there was a family in Gaza, Palestinian family, that had been facilitating the entry of humanitarian aid, so just went and murdered them all. In the end, will end up running Gaza unless this is extirpated. But Biden is openly attempting to stop Israel from doing all of that because he is a fool. Joe Biden's base is that ridiculous convocation of protesters, the pro-Palestinian protesters and the queer trans protesters all facing off in Philadelphia. That is Joe Biden's base. That's what the DNC floor apparently now looks like. Here's the State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, declaring that total victory is not possible for Israel and they should stop pursuing it. Well, we know that it's not possible for Joe Biden or any other apparent administration in the United States for quite a while, except for Donald Trump, who actually was able to achieve total victory against, for example, ISIS. But in any case, here is the State Department saying total victory is no longer a goal.
The point that the president made in his remarks on Friday that you've seen the secretary say a few times is that endless conflict in Gaza in pursuit of some idea of total victory is not going to make Israel safer. We agree with Israel that cannot run Gaza. We agree with Israel on Israel's right and Israel's obligation to pursue for the terrorist attacks of October 7th. But an endless conflict without a political plan forward is just going to leave Israel bogged down in Gaza.
There's literally no political plan forward that the Biden administration has put forward that does not include. All of them include. In fact, the plans so far they've put forward include the formation of a Palestinian Authority government where gets to approve the membership. That was reported by the Wall Street Journal just a few weeks ago. And Joe Biden, terrible at the president thing, setting the entire world on fire. This is what this pathetic specimen does. We'll get to more on this in a moment. First, are you still struggling with back taxes or unfiled returns? This year, the IRS is escalating collections by adding 20,000 new agents and sending millions of demand letters. Now that tax season is over, collection season has begun. Handling this alone can be a huge mistake and cost you thousands of dollars. In these challenging times, your best offense is Tax Network USA. Upon signing up, Tax Network USA will immediately contact the IRS to secure a protection order, ensuring aggressive collection activities like garnishments, levies, or property seizures are halted, providing you with the peace of mind and financial security you need. If you haven't filed in a while, need amended returns, or you're missing records, Tax Network USA's expert tax preparers will update all your filings, eliminating the risk of IRS enforcement. Tax Network USA will evaluate your financials and create a settlement strategy to reduce or eliminate your tax debt, putting it behind you for good. Don't wait any longer. Call our friends at Tax Network USA today. For a complimentary consultation, call 1-800-245-6000 or visit tnusa.com/Shapiro. That's 1-800-245-6000 or visit tnusa.com/Shapiro today. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is now attempting to buy back his own immigration position. So as we know, there's been a massive flood of illegal immigration on our southern border. I went down to the southern border in Arizona. It is wide open under Joe Biden because of his asylum policies that were designed in order to facilitate mass immigration into the country. You showed up at the border, you waved your hand, an ICE agent came and picked you up. You were then immediately shifted into the interior of the United States. Within 72 hours of you hitting the border and Border Patrol picking you up, you were basically shipped off into the interior of the United States so long as you said the magic words, "I fear to go back to my home country." Meanwhile, while Border Patrol agents were being rushed to the site of mass illegal immigration, all the really dangerous immigrants were coming in between ports of entry where there were no people from Border Patrol. I know because I literally went down and visited. You should go check out The Divided States of Biden, available at Daily Wire Plus. You can watch our episode on this, where I literally witnessed Mexican drug cartel drones flying the border so they could monitor the Border Patrol. And, by the way, Border Patrol can't shoot them down without explicit permission from the Department of Homeland Security. Well, as it turns out, according to the New York Post, data show that since 2022, more than 350,000 asylum cases filed by migrants have been closed by the U.S. government if the applicants don't have a criminal record or are otherwise not deemed a threat to the country. Which means that while the migrants are not granted or denied asylum, their cases are terminated. They're just removed from the legal system. Now they just live here. This move allows them to legally indefinitely roam the United States without fear of deportation, effectively letting them slip through the cracks. As it turns out, they're just not adjudicating cases, and then they're letting people run around free inside the country. So now Joe Biden is supposedly going to issue an executive order cracking down on the border. So I have a question. I was told by Joe Biden and the media that without congressional action, there was nothing he could do. And yet here he is doing it, which means that he wanted the border open for all of these years. Of course. According to the Wall Street Journal, President Biden is expected to sign an executive order today that would ban migrants who cross the southern border illegally from claiming asylum, a last resort effort meant to quell voter discontent with his handling of immigration ahead of the presidential election. Biden decided to take the step despite advice from legal and operational advisors that such an order would likely be struck down in court, and even if it survived legal scrutiny, would prove tough to fully implement without a massive infusion of funds from Congress. Okay, by the way, that is not why Biden is doing it. He's specifically doing it because he wants it to be struck down in court so he can say that he did all he could. That is why he's doing it. There are certainly things he can do that will not be struck down in court, like, for example, reinstitute, remain in Mexico, which was the policy under the Trump administration. He could go ahead and finish the building of the border wall. He could go ahead and redefine asylum to mean you actually have to show evidence that you have some reason for running from your home country. But he's not doing any of those things. Political advisors are basically having him sign an empty order that will not close the border so he can blame Republicans for it. It's not going to work. As it turns out, the polls show that he is deeply unpopular on the border, as well he should be, because he is terrible. GOP House Speaker Mike Johnson said Biden was to blame for the border crossing. He said he's now trying to convince Americans he wants to address the chaos he created. The American people know better. That, of course, is exactly right. By the way, since when has Joe Biden ever worried about the legality of his executive orders? This dude tried to use OSHA to make 80 million Americans vaccinated or lose their jobs. Now, again, Joe Biden is attempting to backfill this thing publicly, but realistically, he says, for example, that much of the executive order is not going to kick in until you're at 4,000 or 5,000 border crossings a day. So none of this is going to resonate to Joe Biden's interest. The American people know what they know about him. Now, a note that is worth making here is the media's coverage of what's happening in Mexico electorally. So there's a woman named Claudia Sheinbaum who's very important. Why is she important? Well, she's the new president of Mexico. Now, that's not really very important. The reason I say that's not important is because the president of Mexico will always be an authoritarian autocrat who's run by the drug cartels. At least until there is somebody who's put in power willing to go up against the drug cartels, unleash military power on them and break them. Mexico is run lock, stock, and barrel by the drug cartels. They control the entire American southern border. So why are the media paying such attention to Claudia Sheinbaum? Because she's a historic first, of course. She's a woman, a climate scientist, and Jewish. But she's the kind of Jew that the media like, meaning she's a Bernie Sanders Jew, meaning she has really no affiliation with Judaism, and she rips on Israel routinely, which means that she's a good as a Jew. She's a perfect as a Jew. As a Jew is what you do when you're not really very Jewish and you don't care about Judaism, but you get to hold that in your back pocket and wallop somebody with it when you decide to be anti-Israel, for example. According to the New York Times, Claudia Sheinbaum, a climate scientist and former mayor of Mexico City, won her nation's elections on Sunday in a landslide victory that brought a double milestone. She became the first woman and the first Jewish person to be elected president of Mexico. It was a landmark vote that saw not one but two women vying to lead one of the hemisphere's biggest nations, and it will put a Jewish leader at the helm of one of the world's largest predominantly Catholic countries. can we stop pretending that she's like an Orthodox Jew or something? Like, this is not a lady who's fasting on Yom Kippur. Scheinbaum, a leftist, campaigned on a vow to continue the legacy of Mexico's current president and her mentor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who, by the way, has been thoroughly destroying all of the internal institutions, checks and balances on the leadership of Mexico. So basically, she's just the autocrat's choice. According to the New York Times, López Obrador has completely reshaped Mexican politics. During his tenure, millions of Mexicans were lifted out of poverty and the minimum wage doubled. But he has also been a deeply polarizing president, criticized for failing to control rampant cartel violence, for hobbling the nation's health system, and for persistently undercutting democratic institutions. Still, López Obrador remains widely popular, and his enduring appeal propelled his chosen successor. Or, alternatively, the entire country is run by the drug cartels. But she's historic, and of course, dictatorship and the gutting of institutions is totally fine, so long as you're of the left, according to the New York Times. That's the way this works. López Obrador has directed government attention to addressing the drivers of crime instead of waging war on criminal groups, a strategy he calls hugs, not bullets. It's also a strategy that some might call bribery by the drug cartels. But, again, more of this, says the New York Times. Is it a historic election? Nah, it's just more of the same. But as long as she's a woman, and as long as you can pretend she fulfills your DEI quotient, this means she's a very important person. Already coming up, we'll be joined by Vadi Bakum. You might remember him from a riveting conversation we had on the Sunday special a year ago. He has a brand new book out. It's Not Like Being Black, and it's available for purchase nationwide today. If you're not a member, become a member. Use code Shapiro at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Click the link in the description and join us.